And then what I'm going to do, and don't be shy, I genuinely love to see where everybody is joining us from, so feel free to type into the Q&A. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is also just briefly share the agenda as I've just done. So we're going to share a little bit more about Columbia Climate School very briefly. We are then going to allow Professor Lisa Sachs to, again, have a more of a broad discussion on climate finance and specifically climate finance in Asia. We will detail our MS in Climate Finance program, of course, the application process, and then conclude with a Q&A. And we definitely welcome questions. I do see, wow, Gerald's in Boise, Idaho. I'm very impressed by that. So thank you, Gerald. Now I want to see if anybody from Asia joined us because that's what this time zone was for. So by all means, feel free to share your location in the Q&A. We'd love to see it. So that's pretty impressive, Gerald. So let's go ahead and just very briefly, an introduction to Columbia Climate School. We are the newest school within Columbia University. We were announced in 2020, launched in 2021, and we are truly an interdisciplinary institution. As we know, climate touches everything. And so whether it's through the faculty with which we hire, the degree programs with which we are offering, the courses that we have launched at the university, and the learning community that is really thriving. Our students are coming from various backgrounds, but if the one takeaway is that the climate school is interdisciplinary. And our ethos is that the world requires knowledgeable leaders to work with businesses, communities, governments, and civil society to address the climate crisis. Columbia Climate School's graduate degree programs and other learning opportunities provide an interdisciplinary knowledge base for climate leaders with diverse interests and backgrounds. And again, climate finance obviously is a very specific field, but a critical one in addressing climate change and financing the energy transition. And so that brings me now to introducing our faculty member, Lisa Sachs, who again is going to be performing an overview of climate finance in Asia. But let me introduce her more formally. Professor Lisa Sachs is Associate Professor of Professional Practice at the Climate School and the Director of our MS in Climate Finance program. Professor Sachs also serves as Director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, or also known as CCSI. At CCSI, she established and oversees its interdisciplinary research and advisory work on the alignment of investment, law, practice, and policy with sustainable development goals. She is a globally recognized expert in the field um, in the ways of that laws, policies, and business practices shape global investment flows and affect sustainable development. She works with global stakeholders across sectors to understand the interrelations of investment flows and sustainable development and to influence investment policies and practices to promote the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. Thank you so much for joining, Professor Lisa Sachs. What I'm going to go ahead and do is stop sharing the screen and make sure that we see Professor Sachs. If I could just actually just by all means, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your recent travels and your thoughts on climate finance in Asia.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Alfred, for the nice introduction and for organizing this session. As Alfred knows, I've been very excited about all the developments in Asia, and before going a couple of weeks ago was telling Alfred we need to do more to bring these incredible developments to our community and to reach out to all of you in Asia. So I'm excited to share my thoughts about what I see to be really one of the most incredibly dynamic and interesting regions in this field that I've been working in for decades. And so I thought I'd give a couple of reflections of why I see this moment as unprecedented and incredibly important, what this means for Asia, how Asia should be thinking about these developments from a climate finance perspective. Then would love Alfred to tell us more about the program that I'm so incredibly privileged to direct on climate finance. It's been so fun, but in part because I take these learnings and these reflections to help shape our curriculum and what best prepares students for careers in this field based on these developments. And then I'm eager for your thoughts too, and reactions to my reflections and any questions that you have. As Alfred said, I'm literally just back from two really inspiring weeks in at least a couple of countries, but I have been going now to Asia quite frequently for the past several months because it's clear to me and to others more than ever that Asia is absolutely at the center of the global climate finance transformation. It's remarkable how different the momentum and the feel and the discussion is in Asia from other parts of the world. By the way, I should say that it's quite active in other parts of the world as well. It's not, and we have actually lots of interesting things happening in the US and of course in Europe, but it's very different. And I'll try to mention why I think it's different as well. A lot of what's different about Asia is starting in China, where the transformation of the economy is happening at breathtaking scale that we can't even imagine in this country. The country has built, China has really built end to end clean energy economy from mining to manufacturing to deployment and now to global investment. And it has driven down the costs of the technologies that underpin the energy transition from solar panels to batteries to electric vehicles so dramatically that they have become the default technologies for development around the world. That's extraordinarily significant. Um, this started as development within China and China's own economy and building this both the capabilities but also the deployment up within China. But now Chinese firms are taking that capability global. And recent articles also highlight how China's not only for the past several years, China's been exporting some of these technologies, but most recently, China's really been investing huge amounts in building manufacturing abroad from Africa, from Morocco to Indonesia to Brazil. These are real investments that are building not only deploying these technologies, but building the capabilities to develop industrial ecosystems and to similarly build the end-to-end component parts of the energy transition. That's so significant. And it also, by the way, just absolutely reflects the alignment of the energy transition with economic imperatives because there, of course, was and is recognition of the climate imperative. China's been serious about that from a policy perspective as well. But much of these investments in China have also been driven by economic imperatives and opportunities as well, and absolutely shows the alignment that many of us have been speaking about in other contexts, but not as successfully as China demonstrated it. Where I just came back from on Sunday night is Hong Kong. What's incredibly important for Hong Kong and the real opportunity is that Hong Kong is a major financial hub. That has always been its strength is the ability to connect global capital to Asia's economy. The opportunity for Hong Kong right now is as China's gateway to the rest of the Asian economy and then the rest of the world economy. We are going to increasingly see financing in RMB, replacing a lot of the core financing that was happening in dollars. And Hong Kong is going to lead in those transactions. It has expertise in structuring different types of financial investments and has a very sophisticated financial market. What we are hoping to see and to support in Hong Kong is really a rethinking about the role of a global financial center in how it approaches financing for sustainable development and for the climate transition. And I'll speak in a moment about how different the opportunity to really distinguish itself from other financial hubs and why I find that extremely exciting. I'll come back to that in a moment. The other country I was in before Hong Kong was Singapore, where you see another piece of the puzzle because Singapore has really been thinking about the regulatory piece of an innovation and leading in market design and thinking about regional power grids and cross-border renewables because its energy future is interdependent with the other Southeast Asian countries. We have the extraordinary privilege right now of advising ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's 11 countries now because East Timor just joined about 2 weeks ago when we were at the ASEAN summit, which was remarkable. ASEAN is one of the fastest growing regions in the world, especially from an energy demand perspective, but also because it's growing its robust economy, its industries, its cities, its transport sector, and so on. This is the real energy transition at play. This is where a robust, integrated, low carbon regional energy system, which is an imperative from a climate perspective for the world, for ASEAN, is the most resilient, reliable, affordable energy system that underpins a competitive economy of low carbon industries, digital hubs, because the data centers are growing rapidly in ASEAN, and low carbon fuel production and industrial corridors from the mines to deployment. This is the corridor that we see that is true climate finance, which is that China's technology and scale, Hong Kong's finance, Singapore's regulatory innovation, and then the growth in ASEAN's demand is showing what real how climate finance looks like from a partnership, from a regional perspective, what we need to be financing, where the tools are, and so on. I saw that we have a participant from India too. I'm joining a discussion tomorrow morning, my time, tomorrow evening in India too, because India is also a remarkable, ambitious, but distinct story where it's also becoming a major pole of clean industrialization, which again is linking its financing and investments in the energy and its energy transformation and installing record levels of renewable power last year, one of the top 3 solar manufacturers, but again, as part of a development strategy. So linking its energy expansion to its own development strategy, which is again, similar to how it's to other countries in Asia. This is very distinct from how the rest of the world is thinking about climate finance. And especially in the US and Europe and the UK, where I also spend a lot of time trying to bring clarity, because in those markets, I think the conversation has become confused about the alignment of the finance sector and the transitions that we are trying to achieve, and therefore have developed a major climate finance architecture that is not effective, actually, at mobilizing finance in the way that we're seeing in these countries and in Asia, that has really understood the link between the energy transition and financing and how they can be integrally linked. In the US and in Europe and in the UK, I would say the major issue is that we have, first of all, really disaggregated the concepts of sustainable finance and climate finance from real economy transition. And so we've developed a lot of tools and approaches to climate finance that are confused and disconnected from the real imperatives of what needs to be financed. We've conflated risk management from real financing. We've relied on different aspects of financial regulation, like disclosures and other tools that are not actually effective at mobilizing the finance. So we're spending a lot of time at my center, and I am trying to bring clarity to that confused landscape because it's serving no one. It's neither mobilizing the finance nor helping financial institutions nor companies really rigorously understand the risk. And it's definitely not helping to support any useful transformations in even the developed countries, never mind the developing countries. So I will pass it back to Alfred in a moment, but just to say how much these observations shape my approach to our master's in climate finance program. This program, which really, and I travel a lot, I haven't seen, and I have looked at many programs, and it's wonderful to see the growth in programs that relate to climate finance or to sustainable finance. But I haven't seen another program that's done what we're trying to do at what we're doing at Columbia, which is designing the program to be very analytical and thoughtful about what the trends are. What are we seeing in the international climate finance landscape? How are different markets thinking about it and approaching it? What is the current structure for climate finance? Where is there confusion? What works? What doesn't? But also to be practical and to think about constructively could the climate finance, what could climate finance look like to be practical and impactful? And that includes both the risk management side, which is helpful for those in the financial sector to think about and understand how to assess, understand, and integrate the very real evolving risks that climate change is posing to assets that are financed, to decisions about allocation, to how to manage portfolios or other financial products in the face of very rapid change, or how to think about new types of financial innovations that could address the challenges that we're trying to address. That's on the risk and opportunity management side. And then separately, because it's very distinct, to think about the actual mobilizing finance side, which is different from risk management. That is, what are we trying to finance? Which is the build out of integrated clean energy, clean industrialization, new forms of mobility, resilient cities, decarbonized industry, more resilient landscapes, forest protection, transformation of food systems, and how do we actually finance those, which is very different. And so the goal to me of the program is to help our students to think critically and clearly about those distinctions, but also what they mean, and to question assumptions and to understand different approaches in the rest of the world, which is why, to me, really understanding what's happening in Asia is so critically important for me and for our students to understand those differences. And I'm working on building uh, exchanges between these financial centers in Asia and Singapore and Hong Kong and Shanghai, in India and and Dubai. We should be looking at other financial centers too with the US so that we can really understand and learn about the differences and to bridge these worlds and these financial hubs so that we can, especially for those of us who are working to think really practically about enabling the transformation and to think about resource allocation around the world. There is so much to learn from seeing different regional approaches and seeing these different opportunities. So I couldn't be more excited, frankly, honestly, about the opportunities in Asia right now because of really what is already happening, what is poised to happen within Asia, and because of the scale in Asia, what happens in Asia can really be determinative for the rest of the world. It already is. So actually, let me say one other thing, and then I hand it back to Alfred, which is that I have, in addition to, as Alfred mentioned, to directing this program, I've directed for almost 2 decades a center at Columbia Climate School on sustainable investment, where we really do engaged work with partners around the world. And so now we're doing a lot in Asia so that it's not only about understanding what's happening, which I'm trying to do always, but to helping to support the transformation that's underway, and how can new financial hubs how can financial hubs like Hong Kong or like Shanghai think about the new opportunities for distinguishing itself and really growing as the financial center for the energy transition, and how can ASEAN really position itself to and address the constraints that have held back financing so that it can really grow? And what does that mean for those of us trying to think about financial innovations and who can lead and who needs to work together and how do we actually mobilize the finance? So it's been very gratifying to work hand in hand with the public and private partners in the region to try to really accelerate what we're seeing and to bring it back to help shape our programs so that our students are the best prepared to lead in these transitions all over the world in the years ahead. This is going to be the generation that shapes the next several years, and I'm excited for how much more prepared they'll be than the prior generation. So, with that, Alfred, maybe I'll turn it back to you to talk about the program, and then very excited to have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for sharing specifically where they're joining from. I saw in the chat India, Pakistan, China, Singapore. Alice, I saw your most recent comment, Singapore and Geneva. So Bhutan is represented. We actually have a candidate this year from Bhutan. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for that wonderful global representation. As Professor Lisa Sachs highlighted, we're going to touch on a little bit the MS in Climate Finance program, really just to give you a preview of this degree. We have additional, maybe during the Q&A, I'll make sure to highlight in the chat additional upcoming info sessions that are really dedicated to detailing the graduate program. But we just recently launched the MS in Climate Finance program. It's a 1 year STEM designated degree program. It's 39 credit hours. And this degree is offered by Columbia Climate School in close collaboration with Columbia Business School. It's an interdisciplinary degree that integrates climate science with the fundamental financial management practices that equip students with the financial decision-making skills to respond to climate change. And in terms of the four areas this degree really wants to focus on and ensure that our students are kind of grounded in is the understanding the science of climate change and its varying economic and social and environmental impacts. Also translating the implications of climate research into appropriate financial and business language and decision making, assessing risks and opportunities associated with climate change. Risk is a very big word in this space. And then finally, evaluate the financial tools and strategies that can be applied to accelerate the energy transition and to finance critical investments in mitigation and adaptation. And you heard Professor Sachs discussing that when it comes to building more resilient cities, more resilient landscapes. This is a very broad snapshot of the MS in Climate Finance program. It's a 3 semester sequence, and the program includes a climate core and a finance core. The finance core is exclusively taught at Columbia Business School. And then complementing both the climate core and finance core is a curated list of electives from both the Columbia Climate School as well as Columbia Business School. Your summer semester, you will continue an elective journey and then perform either a capstone workshop, which is a live consulting group project, or alternatively, an internship in the New York City area. I want to touch on briefly, what's interesting about this degree. It's a Columbia Climate School degree in close collaboration with Columbia Business School, but we can't, I know finance is in the title, but the climate aspect is critical. So what is the climate core? The climate core are a set of courses that we feel every single professional in the climate space, regardless of sector or industry, should be anchored in. So the first one is dynamics of climate variability and change. This is the physics behind climate change. This is teaching you the science behind climate change. I always like to say when somebody stops you on the street and asks, do you believe in climate change? And your response is yes. And then they ask you, why do you believe in it? This course is going to give you the why. And it's going to give you the why, especially in how to communicate the why with different constituents. So whether it's executives in the C-suite or policy analysts or students in a K-12 space, you are going to be anchored with the why, the science behind climate change. Then the two pillars in addressing climate change our climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, and the final core course that is unique to the MS in Climate Finance program. And I think today's session, you're getting a really specific preview to the course because of its content, is taught exclusively by Professor Lisa Sachs, and that's International Climate Finance. Finally, your finance core courses are taught by Columbia Business School, and these include Foundations Evaluation, Corporate Finance, Capital Markets and Investments, Climate Finance, and Climate Risk. Something that's important to note is that we have a very diverse learning community within the MS in Climate Finance program, and we have a number of students joining the program that already have a background in finance. So we do offer exemption exams for select finance core courses such as capital markets and investments and corporate finance. If you are already anchored in the subjects or currently working professionals in those subjects, in the summer in the lead up to the actual fall start, you could take an exemption exam. I should note that exempting out of the subject does not reduce the number of credits to complete, but instead allows you additional electives in the MS in Climate Finance degree program. In terms of the climate school, we have a number of electives that are available to you for in the MS in Climate Finance program, and something that Professor Lisa Sachs always wants to make sure that I really kind of drill down on is the fact that this is not a exhaustive list. This is just a preview list because every year they've been developing new degree, or forgive me, new electives for across the Columbia Climate School portfolio. But these include financing renewable energy, sovereign finance, climate and development, social impacts, business society and the natural environment, sustainable debt markets. And then Columbia Business School has a listing of electives that are available to you, and they range from impact investing to sustainability reporting, financial accounting, to sustainable marketing. I also want to highlight that you're joining a very well-resourced learning community in terms of professional development. We're soon to have, we have currently have three, we're soon to have four full-time staff members dedicated to the professional development of the Columbia Climate School learning community. And to put in perspective, the number of students we have currently, it's just above 220 students total. So we have a phenomenal ratio. One of the career development officers is dedicated to the MS in Climate Finance students. And I mentioned earlier that we welcomed our first cohort of 60 students in the climate finance program. In terms of professional development, they host employer info sessions both on-site and off-site. We also have resume and cover letter reviews, an alumni mentorship program, which is phenomenal. You might be surprised learning of an alumni mentorship program given the newness of the school and the programs that we're offering. But I always like to note that the Columbia Climate School actually has several partner programs as well across the university that this alumni mentorship program participates in. So many alumni participate in this program in particular. We also have a sustainability skills seminar. So if you're interested in sustainable consulting or LEED certification, we even had a sustainability skills seminar specifically as a preview to financing renewable energy projects that was taught recently. So we every single year we have a growing portfolio in that space. We also have an exclusive job board and of course a career fair that occurs every February that attracts nearly 100 employers. I'll finally just briefly note that the online application is currently live. It is a holistic review process. Professor Sachs chairs our admissions committee for the climate finance program and certainly can attest to that. But in terms of the online application, it requires a resume along with a quantitative resume. This is where you would highlight your quantitative skills both professionally and academically. We also have two letters of reference. If you've been enrolled in a university in the last 5 years, we ask for one being academic. Then we also require all transcripts and then an English language test if English was not the sole language of instruction in your undergraduate university. We have actually three tests available, the TOEFL, the IELTS, or the Duolingo English test, and then finally a statement of purpose. I strongly recommend taking advantage of our January 15th priority deadline, especially anybody in the audience interested in specifically uh, in merit scholarships or the Stanley Park Climate Finance Scholarship, definitely apply by January 15th. And then your decision is released in March as well. So it gives you more time for planning and research. And then finally, our final deadline is March 1st, 2026. Um, and what I'm going to go ahead and do now is actually, if I should just make one highlight because I realize I sped through a slide that I do want to, and I think I want to spotlight. I know I want to spotlight is specifically who are the MS in climate finance students. And I think it's really important to note that there is no cookie cutter climate finance student. They're coming from very different industries, very different academic backgrounds. In the inaugural cohort, about 65% did come with full-time work experience. About 35% came directly out of undergrad. You can see it's an incredibly international audience with 21 countries of citizenship represented. We're very proud of that, and the average age being 26 years old. But I think it's really interesting is the organizations represented in terms of past experiences. So we've had students at the classic multilateral organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank. And we've also had students in classic kind of finance and banking roles in industries like Bank of America or Goldman Sachs, TD Bank, JP Morgan. But then we've also seen, and I think this is a testament to Professor Lisa Sachs, a number of students with policy backgrounds and their ambitions in returning to policy roles. And so we've had students from, for example, the Ministry of Finance in Indonesia join the inaugural cohort. The students specifically from Bhutan worked at their essentially kind of their environmental ministry or Ministry of Environment. So we've had many students that are also coming from more of a public sector role and really planning to return to their public sector roles. So let me go ahead now. I'd love to open up for Q&A. And now is the time. It's not often you get just Lisa Sachs with this audience to ask as many questions you like, not only about the program, but of course the topic of climate finance in Asia. Maybe you have a question about blended finance. I know Lisa has very strong views on it. So definitely you want to take advantage of this time to ask her questions as it relates to climate finance. But I welcome you to ask questions now. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is stop sharing, and then it's just us. And maybe to kick things off, how about this, Lisa? I have a question that did come in from the registrants. One question was, even when capital is available, many climate-aligned projects in developing countries remain unfunded. What are the most promising ways to bridge that financing gap?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alfred, for um, I'll say why I appreciate that question so much, but also do want to really encourage. I'm excited to hear the questions from the participants. And I had seen when you registered some of the topics that were of interest to you, all of which are of interest to me too. So I hope that you will ask questions not only so that we can discuss and share thoughts, but because they help to inform my own thinking about what's on your mind as well. And as Alfred mentioned too, by the way, that has really helped to inform the continuous development of opportunities in the program, not only electives, which we're adding all the time, but also a student this on a daily basis tells me something they're interested in, and we reach out to my wonderful global network of partners and experts to bring them to our class to talk to the program to talk about the work they're doing and these rapidly evolving areas. Most recently, yesterday, it was about data centers, and so now we're reaching out to the whole community working on the data centers and their implications for thinking about finance. So all of that is to say I'm eager to hear what's on your mind. But Alfred, I particularly appreciate that question because I did come back from Asia feeling extremely optimistic about the landscape there. But the overall picture of climate finance in emerging markets is much more sobering, um, including in Southeast Asia. The challenge for finance is not a lack of capital, and that should be really understood. This is not that we don't have the capital. It's purely a question of allocation, where capital is allocated geographically, sectorally, into what technologies, and so on. So the challenge is actually, we talk about mobilizing capital, which it is, but it's not that we need to create capital from scratch or raise it. It's a question of where it gets allocated. And overwhelmingly, our international financial architecture is biased against emerging markets and developing countries. So even when, for instance, the most glaring example is, but this is true of Southeast Asia too, but let me highlight sub-Saharan Africa, which has 60% of the world's clean energy capacity, 80% of the world's population that doesn't have access to energy, and gets 2% of clean energy financing in the world. That is not because of the lack of fundamentals, lack of need, the lack of investment opportunities. It's because of real structural constraints facing emerging markets that are considered to be very high risk. Parts of the risk are because of the international architecture that makes them risky, because they have to borrow in hard currencies when they when their revenues are in their domestic currency, because they're only able to borrow short term, so they run into the inability to repay even when they're growing rapidly. These are solvable problems by the international architecture, by the international community, but that has decided not to solve them. And so we're working very hard to help to explain how important these structural constraints are. And I think the last thing I would say on this is that understanding the structural constraints is so critical to thinking about the effectiveness of different approaches to address those constraints. So when one really understands what the barriers are, we think differently about tools like debt swaps or instruments that are launched, and whether or not they're the right instruments, how effective they'll be, and so on. So all of that is to say that emerging markets and developing countries um, really do face specific challenges that we are working quite actively to address. And with that, I do see some good questions coming in, Alfred. So can
Abs
I look at those?
Yes, I think the one that's great is Gerald's question. I'm happy to read it. What regulatory frameworks are most effective in the world? Which have the most durability and functional cohesiveness in the world lending space and specifically? And which would you focus on specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Alfred didn't let me schedule this for 6 hours so that we could discuss all of these important developments. No, but it's a great question. Um, the most effective frameworks are those that recognize systemic integration across geographies and across sectors, and that help us think about integrated systems. It sounds basic, but it is the opposite of how so many of our frameworks are set up, to focus on individual corporate entities or individual country, even commitments and frameworks, or isolated sectoral targets that try to achieve something in isolation, when in reality, transitions happen by bringing together multiple actors across a system or across a region to work in concert. That is not only necessary, but it's also pragmatic, because when you can engage different actors in a system, if we think about it in terms of a sector, then it's the suppliers and the off-takers and the technology inputs and the financiers and the infrastructure that's necessary. Then you engage the actors in a system in constructive problem solving. There's a collective interest to find solutions. Nobody's being pushed to do things that are outside of their mandates or their capabilities, which we are so accustomed to do in general by trying to insist on certain goal setting that is impossible for some companies to achieve. In ASEAN, what is so important, but also very interesting, is that achieving the region's energy and economic imperatives and global climate imperatives, but the region's energy and economic imperatives, relies on thinking about their energy system in an integrated way. That is, that they recognize that the energy grid itself has to be interconnected, and that they should be thinking about and linking the major load centers, the growth of the data centers, the low carbon fuel, the industrial corridors to their energy system planning. So regulatory approaches that consider the systemic nature of the transition are absolutely the most effective and and necessary. So that's and the only thing that makes it hard is how much the world has set up systems that are different from that, how much we've emphasized individual corporate pledges and plans and individual net zero corporate, sorry, country level NDCs and commitments, because otherwise the idea of thinking sectorally or regionally about the energy transition is is not actually fundamentally challenging. It should be the most effective approach. So that's my very general answer. And then, of course, we are trying to dig down specifically into what that looks like in different sectors, different value chains, different regions, and how to think about the specific role of the public space within that. Because actually, I'll just end on this point, which is that there's a tendency to think about the role of policy or the role of regulation as needing to come from the central as needing to come from the central government, and if it's not there, we need to be looking for alternatives. But the regulatory framework or public policy includes so many different public entities and tools, whether it's the utility or the city level or the state level or the regional institutions or the national level, and then so many different tools from incentives to mandates to standard setting. So to really we should be really specific and analytical and thoughtful about what is most effective in terms of the regulatory piece or the public piece in this integrated landscape. So that's a big answer to your great question.
Excellent. And we got another question, Lisa. This question also asks, where do you see the greatest gaps between climate and nature financing needs and available
Oof.
capital in Asia today? What lessons from blended finance in Latin America and Africa are most applicable to Southeast Asia?
Yeah, great question. The biggest gap, the biggest fallacy, and the biggest problem I see with nature financing is not distinguishing the appropriate means of financing nature from, for instance, how one would finance energy infrastructure or mobility, and not understanding what's different about different types of sectors. I recently posted on LinkedIn, where I'm quite active and encourage you to look, but about the difference between thinking about investments that are suitable for the market, because there will be revenue streams in the market if it invests and under the right framework can make revenues under types of investments that require coordination, as I was just referring to. And then once there's coordination, there's opportunities for revenue and investment. But those should be distinguished from areas that just are public goods that need public financing because they don't create revenue streams. So the market is not going to properly finance them. Nature is firmly in that last bucket. My biggest concern with the nature financing is that we are expecting market-based tools to appropriately finance nature at scale, which it won't effectively. And trying to do so might lead to disaster, because by trying to commodify nature in a way that makes the markets value nature, it risks letting the markets then commodify nature and make it exploited. Usually when the market can commodify something, it's to exploit it, not to protect it. That's not what markets do. So that is my biggest concern with nature financing, is that we are using the wrong tools, trying to use market-based tools rather than thinking about how to scale public finance. And I think the last point I would say, but that you asked a good question about blended finance. So let me say this. Blended finance is the idea of using public capital to scale private investment and private capital. But there are many ways to do that. And one way to do that that's so often overlooked is that governments should be able to borrow affordably from international capital markets. Developed countries can, but developing countries cannot. But that is a critical way that the private sector can and should be funding public investments by lending affordably to countries so that countries can invest affordably in their own public goods, whether it's education or environmental conservation. That would be the model that I would really encourage in this context, is that we should be thinking about nature, conservation, and restoration as a public good, and thinking about how we can how it should be guided by public investment and public financing, but scaling private finance appropriately to build public resources for that investment. Great question.
Excellent. And Adnan also provided, this is actually was a fun answer to Gerald would be that not every framework fits every country. Therefore, first to do need assessment and evaluate what meets the objective. There's a focus to develop regional regulatory frameworks too, which is great. Um,
Absolutely.
Another question that actually came in earlier that I think could be helpful for the audience as well is maybe for students entering this field, how can they best translate climate finance theory into practice so that their work contributes to real-world systems change rather than just new reporting frameworks? I really like that question.
I really like that question too. What I really see, and any of my students can tell you that I repeat this all the time in my classes, is that I really encourage everyone, especially our students, but everyone, to think critically about the field and what they're trying to achieve, and not just to assume that approaches that are at the forefront of the field are necessarily the ones that are the most effective or the right ones. I'm quite critical of the massive disclosure emphasis and the amount of time that companies and financial institutions are spending doing reporting. When I say that within finance, to those in the financial sector or in the corporate sector, they wholeheartedly agree. But there's less of a critical reflection within that community. The reason I think that that's so important is because when one thinks thoughtfully about what's possible, there are so many different types of jobs and opportunities where we can be helping to develop new forms, new instruments, new ways of thinking about risk and opportunity. Also, one sees, as I tried to emphasize in Asia, because gosh, is it true there, that those of us interested in climate finance shouldn't be limited to that label, because climate finance is also financing mobility and resilient cities and green industrial development and manufacturing and technology and energy systems and energy access. These are all, they might not be labeled. I also have some concern about labeling projects always as climate, because things that are an imperative from a climate perspective are not necessarily financed or pursued on the ground because of their climate benefits. They're sometimes pursued for other as important imperatives: access to reliable, resilient, affordable energy, or livable cities, for instance, that want mass transit, mass transport, or new form or efficient building design where you have cost savings and so on. So I just encourage thinking critically and openly, and to try to get under beyond the narratives and the framing, so that we can think about the whole range of tools and imperatives and what actually works and what are the co-benefits. And that just opens up a huge number of opportunities for really impactful work.
You inspired some additional great questions. There was a follow-up. Gerald's asking, in capital stack assembly, what is the organization or entity doing this with the most effective approach in ASEAN and other leading countries?
let me give one specific. I think that the question, what I'm laughing at is the question of the most effective approach, because that's hard. But let me tell you an effective approach, especially because Alfred mentioned blended finance. I know some of you are interested in that. One model that I am following and trying to inform with interest is a new approach led by Singapore. Let me say one thing about Singapore, where this is to my mind, a petri dish of interesting approaches, some that I think are interesting and effective, and some that I think are decidedly not effective. Singapore is leading in thinking about the energy transition, but because of our framework that encourages national level net zero approaches, Singapore, which has very little land and therefore cannot produce its own clean energy, it's dependent on its neighbors to produce clean energy, and it cannot on its own decarbonize its sectors, partly because it can't decarbonize its energy system, but also because it's part of interconnected value chains like shipping, which is so critically important in Singapore. That's a global industry. So Singapore can't on its own decarbonize, but because we have set up these NDCs, these nationally determined contributions where countries are expected to reach net zero, Singapore is trying to do that through offsetting, which I hate because it's a fallacy. There's no such thing as offsetting. But when it's a complete methodological fallacy, it's trying to say, oh, I'm going to take reductions from somewhere so that I can say I'm not emitting, when of course you're still emitting. There's absolutely no such thing as offsetting. Anyway, so there's a lot of approaches I think are not effective. But what Singapore has also launched, which is very interesting, is a new blended finance vehicle for energy financing in the region. It's called FAST-P, and it is seeded by $500 million from the Monetary Authority in Singapore that put in resources to scale and to leverage institutional capital from Temasek, from I think BlackRock, and from other major institutional investors. That is a way of de-risking or of crowding in private finance to be able to scale investment in energy financing in the region. I think that's a positive and interesting model for other countries to follow, but its design, its proof will be in the pudding, and that's where we're hoping to help shape both the design and the thinking about how a blended finance vehicle, what should it finance, how should it be part of your great question about the capital stack, how should we thoughtfully think about the role of the development finance institutions like the Asian Development Bank, the blended finance vehicles, the private sector on its own, public financing. How do we think about the most effective integration of all of these? And what I will say is that we haven't yet cracked that code. Very few countries and regions are thinking thoughtfully about the whole capital stack and how to most effectively put all of these tools together. We're trying to think about exactly that. So it's a great question.
If I can get a couple more in, Lisa.
Yes.
Yeah. Another is thank you so much for the incredible discussion on climate finance. My question is, how can climate finance frameworks practically evolve to mobilize large-scale timely funding for adaptation, especially for vulnerable countries during catastrophic climate events, while still aligning with existing principles of transparency, accountability, and debt sustainability?
Such a good and timely question, and not fitting for 3 minutes. Such an important question. And I don't think that we're doing it effectively right now, in part because adaptation and resilience can mean many different does mean many different things. And whether we're talking about building, for instance, resilient energy systems versus seawalls versus uh, interventions in agriculture to make agriculture more resilient, each of those has very different appropriate financing mechanisms. What I worry about too is that we often default to things like catastrophe bonds, which I've also written about recently, because we can see what happened in Jamaica, for instance, where if we think about just risk, fiscal risk tools as an appropriate means for adaptation, you see the hard limits of that and the real risk that it poses. There's a hard risk to adaptation, period, because you can only adapt so much as the world continues to warm and emit. So we shouldn't think about adaptation in isolation from mitigation. But if I could give one answer to this tough question because this deserves a class or two. But one answer I would say is that much of adaptation finance, again, should be driven by affordable public borrowing. That's the way to align it with transparency, accountability, and debt sustainability, is that it should be mainly driven by public finance and that countries should be supported in borrowing affordably for those investments, which right now most countries are not. They're trapped in expensive debt and therefore rely on external financing for things that are not transparent, not accountable, and so on. So that would be my one overarching answer, is that we should support affordable public borrowing for what should be really public investments in resilience and adaptation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa. Can I just ask one more? Just one more. What's so because we talked about blended finance and it's such a, it's maybe a hot topic. What is the biggest misconception people have about blended finance? One of our attendees is asking, and its ability to mobilize private capital. And what are the most effective de-risking instruments for mobilizing private capital in emerging markets? And Manaswini said, "P.S. I love your LinkedIn." So thank you,
Thank you.
Lisa.
I love my LinkedIn too because it's a way to try to bring some clarity to this confused landscape. And I love engaging with those who are reading it. So thank you, and glad that you are, and look forward to continued comments there. Your second question is the easiest. It can be really a one-word answer. What's the most effective mechanism for de-risking? Guarantees. There are many. I should say that there are many different tools to de-risk, and we should be analytical and thoughtful. What is the risk we are trying to mitigate, and who can mitigate that risk? Because there are very different answers. So it is not, I'm not suggesting that this is a one size fits all approach, but guarantees are proven to have the highest leverage. And the reason that that's so important is because they are woefully underused. We know them to be effective, and yet we're not using them effectively. So we at CCSI are right now trying to really understand and address that gap. If we know guarantees to be so effective, why are we not using them at scale? Your first question is a bit bigger, which is, what are the misconceptions about blended finance? I would say, again, the blended finance is very important, but it's an umbrella term. It is basically the idea that we use public finance to scale in private capital. But how one does that matters a lot. It matters a lot for whether it is attractive to the private sector, whether it's addressing the risk, how it fits into the capital stack. So there are a lot of misconceptions about how to think about it. Maybe to be able to end on a very concrete note, I will say one thing, which is that a lot of blended finance instruments take a long time to put together because they're very specific, and they are structured in a complicated way that is not how institutional financing works. Institutional finance, like large investment funds in the US and Europe, like asset classes, they don't want to do a lot of work. They don't want to have to really understand specific deals, and they don't want to be locked into financing vehicles for 20 years, even though many of these investments need to be for 20 years. So I think one misconception is just this idea that we can solve this by just creating a new type of product and the investments will come. No, we should be thinking about not only specifically what are the de-risking mechanisms that blended finance solutions can solve, but also how do we make it attractive to institutional investors so that they have easy entry and exit, so that it's something that looks familiar to their investment committees, and so on, so that it is going to be, so that it'll likely scale without so much work. Great, all great questions, and I hope that you will continue to engage. I hope you'll apply. Come join us as we learn about these together. Please engage on LinkedIn. These are excellent questions, and I learn as much from the questions and from your experiences as I do from my own travels and conversations. So thanks so much for the wonderful engagement.
Well, yes, and thank you, Professor Lisa Sachs. Thank you for joining us, all the attendees. And if you do have any questions, by all means, please feel free to reach out to us. I always like to say this is a start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation, especially if you're interested in the MS in Climate Finance program. We have quite a few virtual information sessions coming up, including an application tips and strategy session occurring in November, along with along with a dedicated MS in Climate Finance session that will be joining that session will be Professor Lisa Sachs along with Professor Bruce Usher. So by all means, please feel free to join those sessions. I copy and pasted those in the chat box. And thank you again. And Gerald's asking about a transcript. We certainly are recording this session, and we'll share the recording with all the attendees. So thank you again, Professor Lisa Sachs, and thank you everybody from around the world logging in and hearing this great talk. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you
Bye
so
bye.
much. Bye.